The suns were low in the sky, and the red light touched the dry ground like fire as Ziva stood near the wooden fence and watched her herd of others move slowly across the field with heavy steps and tired groans, while the wind carried the smell of dust and old grass through the empty air, and she felt again the sharp pain in her chest that came every day since her father was gone, and she was left all alone on this wide, quiet land, with no help and no hope. Ziva wiped sweat from her brow, and tightened her grip on the rope in her hand, as one of the drathers turned its heavy head, and stared at her with wide yellow eyes full of sadness and hunger, because the food was low, and the machines were breaking down, and the fence had a crack that she could not fix, and her hands were not strong enough for the work, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something went wrong, and one of the beasts got loose and wandered off into the desert, where no one ever came back. The village was no help, and the other farmers only shook their heads when she passed, and said things like, "You should sell the land, or maybe you should find a husband," or "This is not a job for a girl," and each word was like a stone in her stomach, and she would return to the quiet fields, and speak to the drathers instead, because they did not judge her, and they did not care if her hands were soft, or if her eyes were full of tears at night, when she lay alone in her small stone house, and listened to the wind howl outside. She had tried everything, and sent messages to nearby towns and work hubs, asking for help, but no one answered, or they wanted to many credits, or they said the job was too dangerous, and her herd too wild, and the land too far from safety. And finally, in her last message, she wrote something simple and honest, like this: "I need help, my beasts are dying, and I am to please. If you are strong and kind, come, and I will pay what I can, and take care of the rest." 3 days passed, and nothing came, and she stopped checking the signal tower, and gave up until one morning the wind changed, and she heard the sound of an engine, low and steady, from the hill, and she ran out to the gate, with her heart pounding, because no one ever came from the hill, unless they were lost or trouble, or maybe something worse, and she stood still, as the small old ship landed slowly, and dust flew everywhere, and then the door opened, and out stepped a tall figure in black clothes, with a bag on his back and a calm face, with eyes that looked straight into hers. He was human, and his voice was quiet and deep, when he said, "I saw your message, and I came," and she stared at him, with wide eyes, because she did not expect a human, and she had only heard stories, and most of them were strange or full of fear, and now here he was, real and solid, and his name was Dane, and he smiled like he was not afraid of her herd, or her land, or even her silence. The villagers came to look, and they laughed behind their hands and whispered again, "What can a human do with drathers?" And she almost told him to leave, because she felt the shame burn in her chest. But Dane only looked around and said, "Show me the work," and she did, and he listened, and nodded, and asked questions, and never once looked down at her, or spoke like she was weak. And when he touched the old herder stick and said, "I can fix this," she felt a strange warmth in her belly that she had not felt in a long time. The sun fell low, and the shadows stretched long, and Dane did not leave, and instead he set up a small camp near the barn, and made a fire, and shared a simple meal, and Ziva sat nearby, watching him as the drathers moved close, and one even lay down near him like it trusted him already. And she did not understand why, but she felt the fear in her chest slowly grow quiet. She returned to her house that night, and stood by the window, looking at the stars and the hills, and the smoke rising from Dane's camp, and she felt her hand touch the window glass as if to reach toward the warmth and the calm she saw in him, and her lips moved with a whisper she did not mean to say, like, "Maybe I am not alone now." And then she stepped back, and closed the curtain, and lay down and tried to sleep, but her heart was still awake, and full of questions and hopes she was not ready to name yet, in the lonely fields of Myrafor. The morning came fast and harsh, with orange light breaking over the hills, and Ziva opened her eyes to the low rumble of beasts outside, and the heavy steps of drathers, shaking the ground like slow thunder, while her heart beat faster than it should have, because something felt off, and the herd was not calm like before, and a strange tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. She threw on her work clothes, and rushed out the door with her boots half-tied, and saw Dane already standing by the broken fence, where one of the largest drathers had escaped into the open field, and was now pacing in wide circles, snorting and stomping, with its tail lashing like a whip, and its muscles bunching under its thick hide, as if daring someone to come close. Ziva's breath caught in her throat, because this one was named Grosh, and even her father had feared him on bad days, and she had seen men thrown like dolls by those sharp-hooked horns, and now Grosh was angry and confused, and would charge at anything that moved wrong, and she wanted to shout for Dane to get away, but her voice froze in her chest, because he was walking slowly forward, with no weapon, no rope, just a calm voice and steady hands raised in peace. The villagers had come again, standing at the edge of the field, with their arms crossed and smirks on their faces, whispering, to each other that the human would surely run now, or get crushed, or maybe this would be the end of the girl's foolish hope, and one of them even called out, "Want us to fetch a body bag?" But Dane didn't flinch or look back. Ziva wanted to close her eyes, but something in her refused to look away, and she gripped the fence with white knuckles, as Dane stopped a few feet from Grosh, and began speaking in a low voice, using soft tones and short sounds that made no sense to her, but seemed to slow the beast's breathing, and Grosh tilted his great head, and blinked like a wall inside him had started to fall. Dane reached out one hand slowly, and Ziva's breath hitched as Grosh stepped closer, with a low growl that rumbled in his chest and echoed in the ground, and for a long second time stopped, and the field went silent, and then the beast leaned forward and touched its nose to Dane's palm and stood still like stone. The villagers gasped, and one even dropped his cup, and Ziva felt her legs give out, and she sat on the ground laughing and crying at the same time, because it made no sense, and yet it was real, and the fear that had lived inside her for so long began to melt into something warmer and lighter that made her chest ache in a new way. Later, as the sun climbed higher, she brought water to Dane and tried to speak, but her words felt too heavy and strange, and he only smiled and said softly, "You have good beasts, and they just needed someone who sees them." And Ziva turned her face away quickly because her cheeks burned, and she didn't want him to see the color rising in her skin. They worked the rest of the day in silence, with the herd calm and grazing, as if nothing strange had happened, and the broken fence repaired with new wire and stronger posts, thanks to Dane's strong hands and careful skill. And Ziva watched him when he wasn't looking, and wondered what kind of man leaves his world behind to help a stranger on a forgotten planet, and if he ever felt alone the way she did before he came that night. She sat by the fire near his camp, and shared a meal of root stew and dry bread, and Dane told her simple stories of Earth with oceans that moved like living creatures, and cities that touched the sky, and strange animals with wings and songs, and Ziva listened with wide eyes and soft smiles, while the stars turned above them like glowing seeds in the black soil of space. When he spoke of home, his voice grew quiet, and a shadow passed over his face, and Ziva wanted to ask what he had lost, or why he had come so far, but she kept her question hidden, and only said, "Thank you." And Dane looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, and said, "I came because you asked, and sometimes that's enough." Ziva didn't sleep much that night, because her thoughts spun in circles like Grosh in the field, and she kept hearing Dane's voice in her head, and seeing the calm in his eyes, and feeling the warmth of his smile, and she didn't understand why it mattered so much, but it did. And when she finally slept, her dreams were full of stars and hoofbeats and strong hands reaching out through fire and fear to touch something gentle and true in the lonely fields of Myrafor. The wind blew cold that night, and the sky above Myrafor was full of bright stars that watched in silence as Ziva stood by the gate, with her coat wrapped tight around her shoulders and her eyes fixed on the hills, where something had moved just moments ago, and she knew it was not one of her beasts, because their movements were slower and heavier, and this shadow had moved like a snake slipping through tall grass. Without sound, she called out softly into the night, but nothing answered, and only the wind returned her voice with a whisper that sounded too much like a warning, and she felt the small hairs on her neck rise as she backed slowly toward the barn where Dane was repairing one of the feed pipes, with a soft glow stick clamped in his teeth and his hands busy with metal and wire. When he saw her face, he dropped the tools and walked quickly over and asked what was wrong. And Ziva pointed toward the hill and told him what she saw, and he listened without laughing or doubting, and then nodded once and said, "I saw something last night too, and I was not sure if it was just the wind, but now I believe you." They walked the fence together, checking the locks and lights, and found nothing broken, but Ziva noticed a deep scrape in the dirt near the west corner, as if something with claws had moved through, and Dane crouched beside it and ran his fingers along the mark, and his eyes grew hard and sharp, and he said this was not made by an animal. I know Ziva felt her chest tighten, because danger on Myrafor was rare, but not unknown, and stories of wild raiders and hungry beasts sometimes passed through the village, and were quickly forgotten. But now, with her herd calm, and her heart slowly healing, she felt something trying to pull it all away, and she was not ready to lose it that night. They stayed awake, taking turns by the fire, and watching the hills, while the Drathers slept close to the barn, and the silence stretched long and deep until Dane began to speak softly about the world he came from, and how it had become crowded and loud and full of rules and glass towers and people who walked past each other without seeing or caring, and how he had once been one of them, until the day he left without saying goodbye. Ziva listened without interrupting, and felt something shift inside her, as if his words touched a place she had hidden for too long. And when he paused, she whispered, "My mother left before I could remember her, and my father raised me with quiet hands and strong words, and he told me not to chase shadows, but now I feel like they have found me anyway. Dane looked at her then, and there was no pity in his eyes, only a strange warmth that made her look away because she was not used to someone hearing her so deeply and saying nothing in return but still making her feel seen. As the night grew colder, she pulled her coat tighter and sat close to the fire, and Dane moved a little closer too, and they did not speak again, but the silence between them felt full and safe, like a blanket made of light and breath. Just before dawn, Ziva saw the shadow again near the barn, moving fast and low, and she jumped to her feet with a shout, and Dane was already running with a torch in hand, and they reached the barn to find the outer gate hanging open and two of the feed crates smashed and empty, and a strange oily smell in the air that made her stomach twist. Dane searched the area with quick steps and sharp eyes, and found more claw marks and something else, a small device half buried in the dirt, with blinking red lights and alien symbols. Neither of them could read, and he picked it up and said, "Someone is watching us, and they want us scared." Ziva took the device from his hands and stared at it, and her mind raced through old stories her father used to tell about land thieves and silent mercenaries who waited until a farmer gave up or disappeared and then claimed the land as theirs with fake papers and threats that vanished like smoke in the wind. She looked at Dane and said, "If this is the start of something, we must stand together." And he nodded once and said, "I will not leave you." And she felt something in her chest unlock and rise like fire, and it gave her strength to walk back to the house without shaking. As the sun rose over the hills and the light touched the fields with gold, Ziva stood at the top of the slope and watched her herd move in peace, but her eyes were sharp now, and her hands ready, and beside her Dane stood with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the hills, and between them something quiet and strong had begun to grow, like a new root pushing through old soil in the lonely fields of Myra, for the smell of smoke hid Ziva before she saw the flames, and her body moved on instinct as she ran from the house, barefoot and wild, through the cold night air, with the ground sharp under her feet, and the sky above, full of stars that now looked like they were falling from the sky, because the barn was burning, and the fire reached high into the dark, with bright tongues of orange and red. She screamed the name of every beast she had, and her voice cracked as she reached the fence, and saw shadows moving inside the fire, and the sound of the drathers crying out filled her ears like the sound of something sacred breaking, and her eyes burned with more than smoke as she reached for the gate and tried to push it open with shaking hands that felt too weak before she could. Dane was there already, pulling the gate wide and running straight into the smoke with nothing but a wet cloth over his face and his eyes full of fire and focus, as if he had done this before, and maybe he had. And Ziva watched him vanish into the barn with her heart thudding like a drum and her hands over her mouth, because all she could do was wait and pray that the flames would not take him. One by one the beasts came crashing out of the smoke with fear in their eyes and soot on their hides, and Ziva guided them away as fast as she could, using the broken herder stick and her voice raw with shouting. And when only Grosh was left inside, she froze because the beast was still in the far stall and the roof was starting to fall, and she wanted to run in, but her legs would not move. Dane came out coughing and bleeding with his arms held wide, and Grosh beside him limping and wild, and together they stumbled through the smoke as the roof caved in behind them and the fire roared like a monster, and Ziva ran to meet them and helped them both away from the heat, and she did not notice her own tears until she touched Dane's face and saw the soot come away with her fingers. They collapsed near the water tank, and she poured cold water on his burns with hands that trembled, and her voice was quiet as she asked why he did not wait for her, and he said, "Because you needed me to move, not talk." And she felt her throat tighten with something sharp and warm and strange, and she looked into his eyes but could not hold the gaze and turned away. Later, when the fire was out and only black smoke rose into the sky, the villagers came again with buckets too late and words that felt like stones, and one of them said, "Maybe now you will sell the land." And Ziva did not answer and only looked at Dane, who stood despite the pain and faced them with eyes like steel, and said, "She is not going anywhere." The next day the wind was quiet and the air smelled like ash and loss, and Ziva walked the ruined barn in silence, with Dane beside her, and they did not speak until they reached the back wall, where her father's tools had once hung. And now only black marks remained, and she touched the wall gently, and said, "This land was never easy, but it was ours, and it still is." Dane looked at her then, and something deep passed between them like an understanding, carved in fire and fear, and he said, "Then we will build again." And she nodded slowly, and felt something settle in her chest, like roots digging deep into the burned soil that night. Ziva sat on the old porch with a blanket around her shoulders, and her eyes on the stars, and Dane sat beside her, with his hands wrapped in cloth and his body tired but steady, and they shared silence that felt stronger than words, and she wanted to thank him, but the words would not come. Because they were too big and too full of meaning. Instead she reached out and touched his hand gently, and he turned to her with a look that asked nothing, and offered everything, and for a moment she met his eyes without fear, and saw herself reflected there. Not as a weak girl, or a lost farmer, but as someone worth fighting for. As the wind picked up, and the stars blinked in and out like slow breaths, Ziva felt the weight of the night settle on her shoulders, but it did not feel like a burden anymore. And when she finally rose to go inside, she looked back once, and saw Dane still sitting there with his face turned toward the sky, as if waiting for something more than sleep in the lonely fields of Mirafor. The sun rose slow and soft across the ashes of the barn, and Ziva moved through the smoke like a ghost with her hands touching each scorched post, as if her fingers could still feel the life that once filled this place, and her mind full of voices from long ago that she had tried hard to forget, but now came back stronger than ever with every step she took. Dane found her near the old feeding trough where the drathers once gathered, and he said nothing at first, just stood beside her with his arms folded, and his eyes scanning the ruins, as if searching for pieces that could still be saved, and Ziva knew he would not push her to speak, because he was patient and kind in a way she was not used to, and that made her heart ache. She told him about the photo he found in the house, the one with her as a child, and the tall woman beside her, with a sharp face and wild hair and a smile that looked like it belonged to someone else, and she said that was my mother, and she left when I was 5 to join the frontier guard, and never came back, and no one ever told me why. Her voice cracked, but she kept going because the fire had burned more than wood. And now the truth wanted out, and she spoke of the way her father tried to teach her everything but warned her never to fight, and always to be calm and gentle, because the blood in her veins was too hot and dangerous, and she had to keep it still, or it would burn her from the inside. Dane listened with quiet eyes, and when she paused, he said, "Sometimes the fire is not meant to be hidden." And Ziva turned to him with a question on her lips, but before she could ask it, a sharp sound came from the gate, and a tall figure stepped into view with slow steps and eyes that glowed faint blue under the shadow of a dark cloak. Ziva stepped forward, and her heart skipped because she knew the face, even though it had aged and changed and grown colder. It was Gakar, an old friend of her father who had vanished years ago, and now returned, like a shadow pulled from the past, and he looked at her with a strange smile, and said, "Your mother was stronger than she knew, and so are you." Dane stood close, and did not speak, but his body was still like a wall, and Jaka looked at him with mild interest before turning back to Ziva, and saying, "This land is not safe anymore, and the ones who burned your barn will return, and next time, they will not leave until the farm is gone, and you with it." Ziva asked why, and Jaka sighed and said, "Your father made enemies when he chose to stay and raise you instead of joining the war, and now those old grudges have come back to take what he protected, and you must decide if you will run or fight, because hiding is no longer a choice." The words hit her like a cold wind, and she wanted to scream or cry, but she did neither, and instead she stood straight and said, "I will fight if I must." And Jaka nodded slowly, and placed a small device in her hand, a curved stone with markings she could not read, and he said, "This was your mother's, and she left it for you, and now it is time you learn what it can do." He left without nosy another word, and vanished into the hills, and Dane turned to Ziva, with questions in his eyes, but did not ask them, and she held the device tight in her palm and felt something deep stir in her chest, like a memory she never lived but somehow knew was hers. They spent the rest of the day rebuilding the barn with slow hands and quiet focus, and when the sun dipped low, they sat by the new posts and watched the herd graze in peace, and Ziva spoke softly of dreams she once had of leaving Mirafor and seeing stars and cities and skies that changed color, and Dane told her that he once wanted the same, but now he was not sure if leaving was better than staying. As the stars blinked to life above them, Ziva opened the device, and a soft light poured out, forming shapes and whispers that filled the night air with stories and songs, and a woman's voice speaking in a language she only half remembered, and Dane sat beside her and did not move as the past unfolded like a map across the stars. In that moment she felt the fire inside her, no longer something to fear, but something to guide her, and when she looked at Dane and met his gaze, she did not look away, and he did not speak, but she saw everything in his eyes, and it gave her the strength to believe in herself again. In the lonely fields of Myra, for the sky turned gray with heavy clouds rolling in from the north, and the wind carried the scent of rain, and something else, something sharp and metallic, that made Ziva stop in the middle of feeding the herd, and lift her head with a chill crawling down her spine, because she had smelled that before on the night the barn was burned, and it meant danger was close. Dane stood near the fence, with his hands on the repaired post, and his back straight, as if he too had felt the change in the air. And without a word, he turned and met Ziva. Eyes, and she nodded once and dropped the feed bucket, then walked to the shed where her father's old tool chest still sat under a tarp, and inside it she found the same iron staff her father used to carry on patrols when he feared something might come out of the hills. They had only minutes before the first figure appeared at the far edge of the field, dressed in black armor, with a long weapon slung over his shoulder. And two more behind him, moving in a slow triangle like predators, and Ziva felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a fire that had not left her since the night. Jakar handed her the glowing device, and reminded her that her blood was not weak. Dane stepped forward without waiting, and walked toward the intruders with calm steps, and his voice steady as he called out, "You are not welcome here. And this land is not yours to take." And the lead raider laughed, and raised his weapon with a sneer, saying, "We warned the girl once. Now we take what we want, and the human can crawl back to his dead world." Ziva wanted to scream, but Dane kept walking until he stood between the raiders and the gate, and his hands were empty, but his eyes held something stronger than steel, and the lead raider fired a warning shot into the dirt just inches from Dane's foot, but he did not flinch. He only said once more, "Leave or pay the price." The second raider moved fast, trying to flank him, but Dane turned in a flash and caught the attacker with a hard strike to the ribs, and grabbed the weapon before it could be aimed again, then spun low and brought the raider to the ground with a loud crack, and the third one charged with a roar. But Dane ducked, and used the stolen weapon like a staff, knocking the attacker backward into the mud. Ziva ran forward now, with the iron staff in hand, and stood beside Dane, as the first raider cursed and raised his blaster again. But this time her staff was faster, and it struck the weapon from his grip, sending sparks into the air, and she followed with a second strike that knocked him to the ground, where he groaned and did not rise. The silence after the fight was deep and full, and the only sound was the wind through the broken grass. As Dane dropped the stolen weapon, Ziva stood with the iron staff still raised, breathing hard and full of something bright and fierce that made her feel alive for the first time in years. The villagers had gathered at the edge of the hill, watching with wide eyes and unsure steps. And now they came forward slowly, some with tools in hand, and others with words of shame and awe. And one old woman said, "I did not think she had it in her," and another said, "Maybe the human taught her." But Dane turned to them, and said she did not need to be taught, she only needed to remember who she was. Ziva felt tears rise, but she held them back, and stood tall as the villagers offered help to carry the wounded and repair the fence, and for once they did not look down on her or speak in half-whispers, and she knew the change was real, and it had started the moment Dane stepped between her and the fire. That evening they lit a new fire by the barn, and the stars came out slow and soft as Ziva sat beside Dane and watched the flames dance with shadows that no longer scared her, and she leaned close and asked why he stayed when he could have left, and Dane smiled and said, "Because I saw something worth protecting, and now I see something even more, something that does not need protection anymore." She reached for his hand, and this time did not pull away when their fingers touched, and the silence between them was full of things not yet said but understood, like the strength they shared, and the battles they had faced, and the new path they were building together in the lonely fields of Myra. The sun rose soft and golden over Myrafor, and the light touched every blade of grass with warmth, as if the land itself was breathing easy again, and Ziva stood at the edge of the field with her arms crossed, and her eyes watching the herd move through the pasture in calm, steady lines that spoke of peace, not fear, and her heart felt light in a way it never had before. The wind carried the scent of fresh soil and new wood, and behind her the sound of hammers echoed where the villagers helped raise the new barn stronger and taller than before, with beams from the forest and nails from the trade hub, and for the first time the people worked beside her with honest hands, and not once did anyone ask when she would sell or who would protect her, because they had already seen the answer. Dane walked toward her from the barn, his sleeves rolled up and his face full of dust and sweat, and when she turned to look at him, she did not look away, and her eyes held his with steady fire, because the weight she once carried alone was no longer hers alone, and the silence between them now felt full of promise, not fear. They walked together down the hill to the stream, where the water was clear and cold, and they sat on a flat rock near the edge with their feet in the current, and the quiet wrapped around them like a soft blanket. As Ziva opened her hand and showed him the stone device her mother had left, and said, "I want you to see what it holds." Dane nodded, and watched as she activated. The light and the soft blue glow rose between them, forming the shape of a woman, with sharp eyes and a calm voice that told of war and love and sacrifice. And Ziva listened again to the message she had now played many times, but with Dane beside her the words felt different, heavier, and yet somehow lighter. To her mother spoke of strength, hidden deep in courage, passed through blood, and Ziva finally understood that she had never been weak, she had only been waiting to remember, and now, with the fire behind her, and the future ahead, she was no longer afraid of what lived inside her. When the message faded, and the light was gone, she turned to Dane and said, "I think she knew I would need you," and he shook his head with a smile, and said, "I think you never needed me, but I was lucky to stand beside you." And she laughed, and it was a sound full of warmth and wind, and something new like the start of a song. They walked back to the house, and Dane stopped at the porch and looked out over the fields and said, "I never stayed in one place this long." And Ziva felt her breath catch, because the thought of him leaving was like a hole opening under her feet. But then he added, "But I think I could stay a little longer if that's all right with you." She stepped close, and placed her hand on his chest, where she felt the slow, strong beat of his heart, and said, "I would like that more than I can say." And he looked down at her with something in his eyes that made her cheeks burn, but she did not look away, and for the first time, she let herself feel the full weight of what was growing between them. That night, the village held a quiet gathering near the new barn, and the stars came out in waves, and Ziva stood beside Dane, as the old woman who once doubted her raised a cup, and said to the girl who held the land, and to the human who helped her stand, and everyone lifted their hands in peace. When the fire burned low, and the songs faded, Ziva and Dane walked alone back to the field where the drathers lay resting, and the night air was cool and clean, and she took his hand in hers without words, and led him to the small hill where her father once sat to watch the stars, and they sat together in silence. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he placed his arm around her, and neither spoke, because there was no need, and the stars moved above them, slow and steady, and the future stretched out wide, like the sky itself, full of paths, yet walked in dreams, yet spoke in sea. Closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of earth and fire and rain, and when she opened them again and looked at Dane, she did not look away, because she was no longer the lonely girl in the shadow of her past, but something new, something strong, something whole in the quiet, strong arms of the man who came for work but stayed for something deeper in the wide, quiet beauty of the lonely fields of Myrafor.